Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm delighted to be here and participate in this celebration of Wally Reinhardt's magnificent Metamorphoses panels, as well as to have a chance to talk about my favorite Roman poet. Let me begin with what I think is one of the most scary and uncanny episodes of the Metamorphoses. In Book 6, we find the arrogant Theban queen Niobe boasting about her own good fortune and in the bargain insulting the goddess Latona. Niobe has 14 children, 7 boys and 7 girls, while pathetic Latona has only 2. As it happens, however, these 2 are Apollo and Diana, who at her mother's request take horrific vengeance on the deluded royal mother. As the 7 princes exercise outside the city walls, Apollo, unseen, loses his arrows on them, killing off one after the other. Death hits the unsuspecting victims in the middle of their athletic movements without their understanding where it comes from, and they collapse in the very same postures in which they found themselves when the arrows hit. The scene is repeated a little later when Diana similarly shoots the 7 sisters. Ovid provides detailed, near anatomical descriptions of the young victims' bodies at the moment they go from vigorous physical activity to lethal immobility. And in doing so, he may well have been influenced by artistic representations of the myth, most notably Roman copies of the celebrated Hellenistic Niobe group, which showed the distraught mother surrounded by statues of her murdered children. Fixed in their moment of death, Ovid's Niobids resemble such pieces of statuary, at least in the mind of the reader familiar with such sculptural depictions. However, the tale of horrors is not yet over. Numbed by her grief, Niobe herself is transformed into stone. And there, in her sorrow, her body grew rigid. No lock of her hair could stir in the breeze. Her complexion was bloodless. The eyes never moved in that sad, sad face. There wasn't a sign of life in her features. The palate inside her mouth went hard, and even her tongue was frozen and stiff. The blood could no longer course in her veins. She had lost the power to incline her neck, or to raise an arm, or to walk on her feet, and her inner organs were turned to stone. Yet her weeping goes on. In the swirl of a mighty wind, she was swept away to her native land. There, set on a mountain summit, she pines to this day, and the tears trickle down the crag of her cheeks. Hardening inside and out, Niobe becomes a monumental rock. However, a rock that still weeps, and incidentally is magically whisked away and deposited in her homeland in Asia Minor, where it becomes a feature of the landscape. Ovid describes her new identity as an imago, an image, implying that the petrified Niobe looks like nothing so much as a representation in the medium of stone of a grieving mother. The episode demonstrates the now you see it, now you don't quality of Ovidian metamorphosis. Dying young people look uncannily like statues. A grieving mother looks uncannily like a rock. Oh wait, she is a rock. Or is the rock in reality a woman? Or the statue of a woman? In Ovid's world, people can turn into stones, but stone is not only a feature of the natural landscape, but also a prime material for sculpture. The slippage is therefore not just one between flesh and stone, but between nature and art. I am going to look at a few more examples of what has been called lithomorphosis in Ovid's epic, which I suggest show that the shapes changed into new bodies that the proem announces as the topic of the work can also be read as works of art, with sculpture, by definition concerned with three-dimensional bodies, presenting a kind of master art within Ovid's universe. Lithomorphosis works both ways. People can turn into stone, as we have seen with Niobe, but stones can also turn into people. Famously, Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the earth after the flood by throwing behind themselves the bones of their mother, that is, stones, which are the bones of the earth. In depicting how these stones turn into human bodies, Ovid strikingly compares the process to the emergence of a sculpture from rough stone. They soon grew larger and gathered a nature more gentle than stone. An outline of human form could be seen, not perfectly clear, like a rough-hewn statue partially carved from marble and not yet properly finished. At an intermediate stage, the new humans are just like unfinished marble statues, still at some stage between rough block and full form. In sculptures now on the campus of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Leonardo Taft dramatically imagines the just emerging stone people. But we may well feel reminded also of Michelangelo's famous claim that the marble already contains the statue within, which needs to be freed by the sculptor whose task consists in taking away. In Michelangelo's famous, deliberately unfinished Prisoners, we see the human body still caught in the stone that has always contained it, and from which only the sculptor's hand could set it free. In Ovid too, it seems for a moment that what Deucalion's and Pyrrha's stones will be changed into is not people, but statues of people. Stones, statues, humans. Now you see it, now you don't. The most famous agent of lithomorphosis is, of course, Medusa. And in books 4 and 5 of the Metamorphoses, both the living Gorgon and Perseus, armed with a cut-off head, turn hundreds of people into stone. But what do lithomorphosed people look like? They look, to any casual observer, just like extremely realistic statues of people. Thus, the approach to Medusa's dwelling resembles nothing so much as an outdoor museum where, across the fields and along the tracks, Perseus had seen the statues of men and beasts transformed to stone at the site of Medusa. When Perseus later battles Andromeda's erstwhile suitor Phineus and his followers, Ovid refers to the hero's petrified foes with such terms as signum de marmore, marble statue, imago, image, and simulacra, likenesses or sculptures. And you can see this very nicely in Wally Reinhardt's version of the tale, which imagines Medusa's head as a cubist painting staring down the broken classical statuary of Phineus and friends. That Perseus is in the process of creating a collection of sculpture becomes clearest in his cruel taunt of the suppliant Phineus. I shall make you a lasting memorial for all posterity. You'll be on permanent view in the house of my father-in-law, that my wife may console herself with her former intended's likeness. The lithomorphosed rival will become a piece of interior decoration. The mass petrifications of Perseus and Medusa serve, I suggest, as what literary scholars call a mise en abîme, reflecting on Ovid's own metamorphic art. In the course of the poem, which runs from the first origin of the universe to Ovid's own times, the poet, through his words, creates a world of shifted forms, of new bodies created by his art, just as a sculptor creates the artificial bodies that may fill a garden or a house or a museum. In the world of the Metamorphoses, famously, nothing retains its shape, which is why you can never be sure whether something is a stone or a person or a sculpture, or, in other words, whether something is nature or art. Nature, we would have thought, has fixed laws, including clear demarcations between individual species. But it is exactly these laws that in the Metamorphoses are continually broken. Art transcends nature, even being capable, like Deucalion or Michelangelo, of freeing a human from a block of stone. The story where the relations of art and nature, of sculpture and human bodies come to the fore is, of course, that of Pygmalion. I give you here a version by Rodin, which seems to play with Michelangelo's idea of the non finito, the sculptor just emerging from the marble block. Here, it is not only the sculpted woman who undergoes a metamorphosis from stone to flesh, but the male sculptor himself, who seems to be just as much of a work of art as is his beloved. In Ovid, as a matter of fact, the statue fashioned by Pygmalion is made not of marble but of ivory, and thanks to the superior talent of the artist, it is more than lifelike even before its metamorphosis. This heavenly woman appeared to be real. You truly suppose her alive and ready to move, if modesty didn't preclude it. Art was concealed by art to a rare degree. Pygmalion's marveling soul was inflamed with a desire for semblance of body. Again and again his hands moved over his work to explore it. Flesh or ivory? No, it couldn't be ivory now. Ovid stresses throughout how deceptively similar the sculpted woman is to a real one, to the extent that even her creator is no longer sure whether he is touching ivory or flesh. The sentence in the Latin that I've underlined is key, both for the Pygmalion story and for Ovid's theory of art in general. Ars adeo latet artis sua. If art is mimesis, as Aristotle held, the perfect art is the one that makes art disappear, that utterly blurs the boundary between fiction and reality. Now you see it, now you don't. Pygmalion himself, in caressing the statue, is afraid of bruising her skin. He imagined his fingers sinking into the limbs he was touching, frightened of bruising those pure white arms as he gripped them tight. I've given you on the slide a detail from Bernini's Abduction of Proserpina, which, quite possibly alluding to Ovid, stages a virtuoso breaking down of the boundaries between rigid marble and soft flesh, revealing Bernini to be a new Pygmalion. In Ovid, the artist initially needs to content himself with showering his beloved with gifts and taking her to bed with him. However, once he has prayed to Venus, somewhat bashfully, for a wife similar to the ivory girl, Pygmalion finds that when he comes home and touches his statue, this time it, or she, really does give in to his touch. The ivory gradually lost its hardness, softening, sinking, yielding beneath his sensitive fingers. By the grace of Venus, the ivory woman comes to life, marries Pygmalion, and the two live happily ever after. Our short overview of lithomorphosis and related phenomena in the Metamorphoses has shown us actual human bodies that look uncannily like sculpture. Bodies changed into sculpture like stone. Stones turned into sculpture like bodies. And a sculpture transformed into an actual human being. In Ovid's world, the boundaries are fluid not only between inanimate material and living flesh, but also between nature and art. Are we looking at a human, a stone, or a sculpture? If art is hidden by art, we may never know the difference. I will now broaden my horizon and look beyond the Metamorphoses at some of Ovid's other works. What I hope to show is that the stress on art, Latin ars, that we find in the epic poem is symptomatic of Ovid's interest and attitude elsewhere. It would be silly and reductionist to claim that Ovid poems are all about the same thing, but I do want to make the case that there is a leitmotif or even a message found across many of his works, and that is what I call the triumph of art. The idea that ingenuity and creativity can make a world that, while it is artificial or even fake, think of Pygmalion's statue, is often indistinguishable from reality, and that is Ovid's subversive claim, not infrequently preferable. Ovid, as you know, was born in 43 BCE in Sulmo, modern-day Sulmona in Italy, and died in 17 CE, exiled in Tomis, now Constanza in Romania. And just in keeping with our sculptural theme, I've given you pictures of the identical statues found in both locations. According to the poet himself, young Ovid from an early age felt an inclination to poetry, but, like so many a youngster, was discouraged by his more practically minded father, who pointed out that not even Homer made any money by his celebrated work. When the young Ovid attempted to oblige his parent and write in prose, this turned out to be impossible. Convinced by his argument, I abandoned Helicon completely, struggled to write without poetic form. but a poem spontaneously would shape itself into meter. Whatever I tried to write turned into verse. In other words, the precocious boy's speech underwent a metamorphosis, a destabilization similar to many found in the Metamorphoses. Is it still prose or already verse? Natural speech or a verbal artifact? There's an apocryphal version of the story from a late Ovidian Vita, and here Ovid's father displays a more aggressive parenting style, actually beating his uppity son for his unfortunate habit of versification. Distraught, the boy exclaims, "Spare me, father, I will never make verses again." Of course, what comes out of his mouth is a dactylic pentameter. Parce mihi numquam versificabo pater. This, incidentally, is not a line that it would have scanned for Ovid, who still measured the final O of versificabo as long, but that is not the point. The point is that in Ovid's own early life, as fictionalized by himself and others, art triumphs over nature, even if this means a thrashing for Ovid Jr. The poet's theory of art is nowhere more apparent than in the work that bears the programmatic title of Ars, the famous or infamous Ars Amatoria. To the consternation of many modern readers, this art of love isn't really very much about love, but it is very much about art. Now, ars in Latin means not only what we call art in the sense of the visual, verbal, or musical arts, which is the sense in which I've been using it so far when talking about sculpture and about Ovid's own poetic art. It also, like Greek techne, means a skill that can be taught and learned, or even a handbook that teaches such a skill. English has the same idiom. To quote a few book titles that randomly came up on an Amazon search when I searched for the art of, I found the art of war, the art of dying well, the subtle art of not giving a fuck, I'm not making this up, the art of tidying up. So you get the idea. Now, just as in these English examples, in Latin too, calling a field of expertise an art, even if it's just clearing out your closet, elevates it to a higher plane of human ingenuity and achievement, and hints at a continuity with the arts practiced by actual artists, whether they be writers, painters, or musicians. Thus, Ovid's art of love is an art in the sense of being a practical skill that can be taught in an how-to book, or so the poet claims. But it is also an art similar to the activity of a poet or sculptor. How so? In the Ars Amatoria, Ovid teaches young men and women first how to find and seduce erotic partners, and then how to keep their relationships stable and enjoyable. Like other artists, Ovid's students are told how to create something, a successful love life. And as it turns out, the way to do so is through mimesis, the artful imitation of reality with such consummate skill that, like Pygmalion's statue, the work of art becomes indistinguishable from reality, or even becomes reality itself. Thus, the young man is not instructed to fall in love. He is told to imitate a lover. You must play the lover, ape heartache with words, use every subtle device, literally every arte, to compel her belief. Note the language of the stage. Ovid's students are meant to enact a love story, putting on a show for the opposite sex, which in turn is putting on a show for them. What this means is, to put it more bluntly, that the Ovidian lovers are supposed continually to deceive their partners and to construct an intricate web of lies, which range from the simple to the elaborate, the little fib to the tall tale. For example, giving gifts to one's girlfriend is a way to her heart, but can also be financially ruinous. Luckily, Ovid has tips for his male students on how to score points without breaking the bank. At harvest time, when fields are full, boughs heavy, send round a basket of fruit. Say it come from your country estate, though you really bought it at some smart city shop. Apples from the supermarket become impressive when claimed to be an import from the boyfriend's non-existent manor house. The banal has become glamorous. Art has triumphed over reality. Note that both parties benefit. The woman is pleased with her paramour's thoughtfulness and taken with his real estate holdings. The man has made a big impression for very little effort. A much more elaborate deception is suggested to the young women, who are told to put on for their lovers an elaborate farce involving a non-existent jealous husband. Act scared. Though the door's quite safe, let him in by the window. Look nervous. Have a smart maid rush in, scream, "We're caught," while you bundle the quaking youth out of sight. What is the point of staging a near capture in flagranti when, in reality, there's absolutely no danger? This is where Ovidian psychology comes in. Pleasure too safely enjoyed lacks zest. To remain interesting, a relationship needs a certain amount of spice, the spur of jealousy, the frisson of the difficult and illicit. The young man who has climbed in through the window and been hidden in a closet feels renewed excitement about his girlfriend. The woman has a more dedicated lover. Note, though, that Ovid warns the women not to overdo it. But be sure to offset the fright with some moments of carefree pleasure, or he'll think a night with you isn't worth the risk. What Ovid suggests in the Ars Amatoria, then, is better living through art. This art, like all art, is a form of deception, of make-believe that would have us think that something exists that in reality doesn't. The deception is in the first place directed at the erotic partner, who is bamboozled into believing in the boyfriend's apple orchard or the girlfriend's cuckolded husband. In order for this artful deception to work, the partner must not realize that there is any art involved. Art is most effective when concealed. This, of course, reminds us of Pygmalion's statue, where art was concealed by art to such a degree that even the artist himself began to be deceived. Something similar happens in the art of love. Ovid, twice in his Amadore didactic, reworks a famous passage from Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. The mid-1st century BCE didactic poet famously attacked romantic love, which according to his Epicurean creed was a mental disturbance making people's lives miserable and thus needed to be stamped out. His satirical treatment of the follies of lovers is delightfully brutal, including one passage in which he castigates the ways in which besotted young men will gloss over their girlfriend's physical defects by giving them cutesy nicknames, which, incidentally, in Lucretius' text, are all in Greek. The black girl is brown sugar. A slob that doesn't bathe or clean is a natural beauty. Athena, if her eyes are grayish-green. A stringy bean pole's a gazelle. A midget is a sprite, cute as a button. She's a knockout if she's giant's height. The speech-impaired has a charming lisp. If she can't talk at all, she's shy. The sharp-tongued shrew is spunky, a little fireball. If she's too skin and bones to live, she's a slip of a girl. If she is sickly, she's just delicate, though half dead from TB. Obese with massive breasts, a goddess of fertility. Snub-nosed is purred. Fat lips are pouts begging to be kissed. And other delusions of this kind, too numerous to list. Ovid takes this demeaning lookist list and turns Lucretius' advice on its ear. In his Art of Love, the young men whose job it is to be pleasant to their partners are explicitly instructed to espouse the very practice that Lucretius had attacked. Take care not to criticize girls for their shortcomings. Many have found it advantageous to pretend such things didn't exist. Labels minimize feelings. She's blacker than pitch, try brunette. If she squints, compare her to Venus. She croaks, she's Minerva. A living skeleton, svelte is the word. Call her trim when she's minuscule, or plumpish when she's a fat lady. Use proximate virtues to camouflage each fault. We can probably agree with Ovid that this practice is likely to make the women feel better about themselves, not to mention considerably more favorably inclined towards the men who flatter them in this way. But perhaps it will also make the men feel better about their girlfriends. If you can convince yourself that your lady love's squint is not a disfiguring defect, but a charming trait that makes her resemble the goddess of love herself, you're going to be much happier and presumably more enthusiastic about the relationship. The Pygmalion of the Metamorphoses came close to deceiving himself through his own art, and with a little divine help, the lifelike work he had created really came alive. Is there the potential for a similar effect in Ovid's Art of Love? I would argue that there is. And first draw your attention to the advice given in the sequel to the Ars, the Remedia Amoris, or Remedies for Love, in which Ovid instructs unhappy lovers on how to fall out of love. One of the techniques he recommends is to mentally dwell and in fact exaggerate the flaws of the beloved but unattainable woman, reversing his advice given in the Ars. Whenever you can, run down your girl's attractions. Fudge your true opinion by a hair's breadth. If she's plump, then call her bloated. Black if she's swarthy. A svelte girl labeled beanpole doesn't sound good. She's anything but naive, then say she's saucy. Or if she's virtuous, naive is the word. Whereas we previously saw lovers deceiving one another, this lover is told in no uncertain terms to deceive his own judgment. Once the besotted man can convince himself that his slim beloved is in fact anorexic, he has a much better chance of freeing himself from his infatuation. Better living through art, indeed. In fact, it turns out that for Ovid, love itself, that is, the very feeling of love, is ultimately the mimetic creation of the lover artist, him or herself. In order to fall out of love, the student of the Remedia only needs to pretend not to be in love. Simulate what you're not. Pretend the fit's abated. Faking it will lead to the genuine thing. Love enters the mind through habit, is by habit evicted. The man who can counterfeit sanity will prove sane. By putting on a show of not caring, the lovesick student will in the end really not care anymore. But it also works the other way around. Remember how in the Ars, Ovid advised the student to play the lover, that is, to pretend being in love. The main purpose of this was to impress a potential partner with one's own fake devotion. However, it turns out that there is a frequent side effect. Very often, that passion a gallant feigns in his opening round will become the real thing. So, yes. Fake love may become true love, which provides an extra reason why women should favor the advances of Ovid's well-instructed male students. Pygmalion crafts a statue that is so deceptively lifelike that it deceives himself and really comes alive. Ovid's amatory students are putting on a love story that is so convincing, even to themselves, that it turns them into genuine lovers. This is what I call the Ovidian triumph of love. Note, though, that the final step, the fake turning genuine, the work of art becoming reality, is not a necessary condition for this triumph. Instead, I would maintain the real triumph of art consists in our being unable to tell, because art is so concealed by its own art, whether something is real or a fabrication. Did Pygmalion's statue really come alive, or did he spend his life married to an ivory doll? Does my boyfriend really own an apple orchard, or has he been to Whole Foods? Is my partner really madly in love with me? Am I? Does it matter? When telling the unhappy lover to convince himself that his beautiful beloved is really ugly, Ovid, as we have seen, tells him to deceive his judgment by a thin dividing line, parvo limite. In this particular case, this is the line between voluptuous and fat, porcelain skin and deadly pallor. But it is also the line between life and art, a line that is so thin that it is often imperceptible. Now you see it, now you don't. Rock or sculpture, sculpture or person, feeling or fake. It is the triumph of Ovid's art that we cannot tell, and that goes for his works themselves. Is the poet really telling us that we should conduct our love lives according to a handbook? Are we really supposed to believe that this rock was once a woman, and that human beings were once stones, and that Pygmalion's wife was once a piece of crafted ivory? Who knows? In this world, nothing retains its shape, and that, despite of what Pythagoras says in Book 15 of the Metamorphoses, is not a law of nature. It is Ovid's triumph of art. Thank you.
My first expression of thanks certainly goes out to Matthew, not only for his kind introduction, but for inviting me to participate in this wonderful gathering. Thank you for all of you for coming. This is a remarkable turnout. My second expression of thanks is to Lynn for extending another invitation, which is to be a part of Wally Reinhardt's beautiful exhibition downstairs at the Gray. And it is, in fact, to you, Wally, that I would like to dedicate this talk. This talk, I have to warn you, isn't just about Ovid. Ovid, I think, lives or permeates virtually everything that I have to say, as well as Katharina noted, Lucretius. But it's really a talk about the afterlife of Ovid, especially as it relates to representations of nature. So my aim is to challenge the tradition of landscape or landscape studies in the Italian Renaissance and Northern Renaissance as well, even hopefully questioning the term landscape itself. Meraviglia, a word at once charged with fear and desire. In one of his earliest records of personal exploration, Leonardo da Vinci, not yet 20, expressed the exhilarating sense of tension the two emotions awakened in him. Writing around 1480 in the Codex Arundel, the young artist describes with almost mystical undertones his discovery of a dark cave near the coast. Quote, "Drawn by my eager desire, wishing to see the great manifestation of the various and strange shapes made by formative nature, I wandered some way among the gloomy rocks, coming to the entrance of a great cavern, in front of which I stood for some time, stupefied and uncomprehending of such a thing. Suddenly, two things arose in me, fear and desire. Fear of the menacing darkness of the cave, desire to see if there was any marvelous thing, alcuna miracolosa cosa, within it," unquote. Approximately 3 years later, Leonardo was to conceive the first version of his Madonna of the Rocks, seen here. Its strange motions unfolding in a watery, echoing cave chapel, at once a veritable marvel of devotional painting and geological formation. His simultaneous sensations of desire and dread resonate with similar such descriptions of dark, pathless realms in literature. As we are reminded by authors such as Homer and Ovid, ranging to Dante and his savage wood, harsh and strong, from the Inferno, to, of course, Shakespeare, it is, after all, in the wild forests and hidden caves, in the zones of magic, myth and monsters, the haunts of otherworldly powers, that the supernatural happens. Springing from feelings of longing and appetite, certainly in Leonardo's case, obsession for something that one cannot have not yet seen, or could not yet reach, the ever-fugitive, shimmering sense of the marvelous is inseparable from that of wonder. The Greek word for wonder, thauma, owes its origins to the marine god Thaumas. As told by Hesiod in his poem of all origins, the Theogony, Thaumas embodied instability as the shifting force of the sea. The god's genealogy reflected this unstable, precarious aspect. The lineage of this deity, springing as it did from both the daughters of Nereus, shown here at left, and the monstrous line born of Phorcys and Cato, primordial sea deities associated with the hidden dangers of the deep. In equally contradictory fashion, Thaumas in turn fathered the fleet-footed Iris, the divine messenger and goddess of rainbows, and the fierce Harpies, personifications of the storm winds, two of whom Hesiod mentions by name, and they're absolutely wonderful, evocative names, Storm Swift and Swift Wing. And yet, as Christine Hunzinger notes, aesthetic thalma escapes this fleetingness. A sense of wonder, quote, springing from a work of art does not vanish, even after the phenomenon is understood. How appropriate in the context of the age of exploration that thalamus was an oceanic spirit. Not only a description of discovery, but a declaration of possession, the marvelous resonates with special poignancy in the travel writings of Christopher Columbus. In both its potential for revelation as well as danger, wonder is inseparable from a twin passion it was often said to arouse, curiosity. All manner of discoveries near the turn of the 16th century, animal, vegetable, mineral, consequently ignited a search for a new kind of representation and description through visual means. Writing in 1535, only a few decades following Columbus's 4 voyages to the New World, the Spanish civil servant Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo found spoken language to be inadequate in describing a plant newly discovered in the Americas. And so Oviedo turned to the pictorial for expression. The plant, he believed, quote, needs to be painted by the hand of a Berruguete, or Pedro Berruguete, or some other excellent painter like him, or by Leonardo da Vinci, or by Andrea Mantegna, famous artists whom I knew in Italy, unquote. A number of other artist-naturalists on either side of the Alps are certainly deserving of inclusion in this rather incongruous short list of masters quoted by Oviedo. Their expeditionary spirit very much in sympathy with that of Leonardo and Mantegna. Chief among them are Albrecht Dürer and Piero di Cosimo, responsible for this pair of examples, both real and fantastic. I was in touch with the horticulturalist, a curator at the cloisters many years ago to try and identify the specimen on the left side of Piero's Death of a Nymph in London, and she was completely stumped. It's a hybrid of about 4 different plants. Nor did any other Tuscan contemporaries prove more responsive to the Latin poet-philosopher Lucretius and his Epicurean didactic poem De Rerum Natura than the 2 artists I just mentioned, Piero and Leonardo. And here I must mention, this is a frontispiece from De Rerum Natura, and these are the 2 panels that I'm thinking of in particular by Piero here in New York that you can visit at your peril. At the Metropolitan Museum, and it's of course book 5 of Lucretius's cosmic poem, in which he describes the harsh, violent, unforgiving beginnings of humankind, seen here in these 2 domestic panels, believe it or not, that would have originally belonged in a Renaissance bedroom, as imagined by Piero. The same should certainly be said in terms of their fascination with ancient texts about Piero's and Leonardo's relationship to Ovid himself. We know from his book inventories, for instance, that Leonardo owned a copy of the Metamorphoses, a text which parenthetically would have also served as a potential source of information about Pythagoras and vegetarianism, along with Diogenes Laertes' Lives of Eminent Philosophers that Leonardo also owned. Meanwhile, no other ancient poet was as rich a source to mine for inspiration for Piero's mythological imaginings, as seen here, as Ovid. And of course, we have the Centauromachi shown at top here, drawn from book 12 of the Metamorphoses, the Liberation of Andromeda painted for the Strozzi Palace, seen here at bottom, inspired very closely in this particular case by book 4 from the Metamorphoses. And it wasn't only the Metamorphoses that served as a source of inspiration for Piero, because here we have his so-called bacchanals painted for the Palazzo Vespucci for a wedding that took place in 1500. That is drawn from Ovid's Fasti, specifically book 3, that describes the celebrations of Bacchus in the month of April and the discovery of honey and its aftermath. There is, to be sure, a wealth of pictorial examples from antiquity itself that correspond directly to the wonders of nature. And here I show the splendid example of the House of Livia, a kind of pastoral virtual reality, assuming the form of a more domesticated hortus. And here, authors like Nate Jones have explored this idea of metafictionality as it relates to these kinds of immersive realms. By contrast, there's certainly something of the untamed about the next two examples. Writing about the Odyssey landscapes seen here on the left, from the 1st century BCE, now in the Vatican museums, J.J. Pollitt describes, quote, "The human body and human activity are presented here not as the sole or primary object of artistic interest, as they were for centuries in earlier Greek painting, but rather as one facet of a vast cosmos in which atmosphere, misty vistas, the broad horizon of the ocean, rocks, hills, trees, and springs are essential and enduring elements. It is the human participants," Pollitt continues, "that, quote, begin to absorb some of nature's own character and become themselves shadowy, fluid, and impressionistic. Circe and Odysseus become almost incidental, and their conflict is almost forgotten," unquote. Though very much a man of the city, Ovid had no equals in evoking a palpable sense of atmosphere, other than Lucretius, through his own descriptions of nature. These descriptions are less striking, I would argue, for their detailed specificity than their evocative, almost impressionistic visual allure. Exploiting nature's lushness and strangeness, Ovid pictured landscape forms that were sufficiently varied to accommodate not only the Augustan taste for the rustic and the idyllic, but to also venture far off what he calls the sweet path in Book 3 of the Metamorphoses. He does so to transport us to lands suggestive of darker, more threatening powers. Whether it is the myths of Callisto, Actaeon, Echo and Narcissus, Tereus and Philomela, Peleus, certainly Circe and Picus, or Adonis, to name the most prominent examples, dense and dark forests, but even at times tranquil groves, are suggestive of tragic endings. Speaking of which, in one of his several versions of Venus and Adonis's last embrace, Titian offers us a glimpse of what an empathetic landscape looks like. Here, meteorological effects anticipate tragedy, as embodied by the ominous clouds gathering above the impatiently departing, ill-fated hunter. How next does one categorize, for example, a pastoral poesia or visual poem as enigmatic, yet as suggestive and affecting in mood as Titian's master, Giorgione's evocation here of a tempest, the so-called La Tempesta, a tiny tour de force of natural phenomena that has also been connected, in fact, to Lucretius's De Rerum Natura in the scholarly literature. And insofar as this coastal plain, represented by Piero once again, remains a recognizable landscape in format and appearance, what do we make of Natura naturans, to which I will return, nature naturing, that, as conceived here by Piero, not only prompts the viewer to mourn a human death, but a representation of nature that is inhabited by organisms, not only animal and half animal, but even plant, that actively grieve themselves. Piero's own painted poems do not so much resemble landscape in any traditional sense as they represent living, sentient, responsive environments. To return to an earlier pictorial example here by Piero's hand from the hunting scenes, nature takes over completely. Piero reanimates landscape as a vital, pulsing presence, his dense woods charred by fire and choked with smoke, ringing with the sound of wailing, growling beasts and hunters alike. Landscapes that stir in defiance against man-made order and control. Appending the conventional hierarchy between subject and setting, man and nature, Piero not only rehabilitated landscape as a genre worthy of a distinguished painter, but raised it to the status of primary subject, even individualized protagonist in its own right. Human and animal kind are here entirely at nature's mercy. Hardly is this no longer, or any longer, the anthropocentric universe of Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and their fellow Neoplatonists. The primacy of nature was the fuse that drove all of Leonardo's own investigations, as testified by the following pair of drawings, attesting to the symbiotic union of observation and imagination, as torrents of water or studies of plant life become fictional coiffures, in this case wigs, that were studied for a representation of the Spartan queen Leda. And so too it was for Albrecht Dürer, who continually worked in nature. If you can actually spot this little artist drawing in plein air. You can imagine this almost being kind of a mirror image of Dürer's own artistic process from a very young age. It was Dürer who recorded, like Leonardo, all manner of the micro and macrocosmic natural phenomena, as seen in these two examples here. Few images, perhaps, could attest more eloquently to Dürer's and Leonardo's claims than this particular watercolor of a blue roller's plumage and anatomy, virtually indistinguishable from the real thing. And one of my favorite things to do in class is actually to pull up this image and at least get maybe a couple of students to express a sense of surprise or even confusion as to which one is the real thing, or in fact they're just two painted representations or two photographs of a real ornithological specimen. Usually my students are too smart for that, but one of these days I hope to confuse him, because that is precisely, I think, what Dürer would have liked us to assume. Anything but as light as a feather, one source of wonder for Dürer weighed up to 2 tons of shy wonderfulness. And you see him here. And this could, by the way, be the source of an entire lecture or 5 in its own right. Because here we meet Dürer's now legendary woodcut of an Indian rhinoceros, a beast described by Pliny, but to my knowledge, at least, not by Ovid. I might stand corrected. Thought by Pliny to be the archenemy of the elephant. A beast that Dürer himself had never seen and that drowned when the ship carrying him tragically sank off the Ligurian coast during its passage from Lisbon to Rome via Marseille. In Dürer's inscription accompanying his preliminary pen and ink study, blown up here at bottom, and possibly transcribed verbatim from a description sent to Dürer from Lisbon by the Moravian printer-typographer Valentim Fernandez, we read, quote, "In the year 1513, on the 1st of May, was brought to our King of Portugal to Lisbon such a living animal from India called a rhinoceros. Because it is such a marvel, wunder, I had to send it to you in this representation made after it," unquote. The line about wonder is omitted in the inscription accompanying the finished print, however. As Susan Dackerman claims, the revised statement shifts attention to Dürer's own work, redirecting consideration from the marvel of the animal to the marvel of its represented form by the artist. Late in his life, Dürer described his own God-given artistic skill as wondrous, wunderlich, in his 4 books on proportion. The process of understanding, describing, and ultimately controlling a force capable of producing offspring as wondrous as the rhinoceros was one of endless fascination, as were, by extension, the uncatalogued life forms recorded or conjured by the painter's brush and the poet's pen. Every new animal, spice, or botanical specimen held the power to astound and throw the beholder off balance, prompting the Dominican Albertus Magnus in his commentary on the Metaphysics of Aristotle, written between 1245 and 65, to define wonder as an actual physical symptom, and a very powerful one at that, triggered when Albertus, say, miraculously himself resuscitates a dead child, as seen here. Wonder, Albertus wrote, is defined as a constriction and suspension of the heart caused by amazement at the sensible appearance of something so portentous, great, and unusual that the heart suffers a systole. Hence, wonder is something like fear in its effect on the heart. This effect of wonder, then, this constriction and systole of the heart, springs from an unfulfilled but felt desire to know the cause of that which appears portentous and unusual. So it was in the beginning when men, up to that time unskilled, began to philosophize, unquote. This is quite a remarkable statement, because astonishment and wonder, sensations so thrilling as to be momentarily immobilizing, causing the lungs to tighten and the heart to skip a beat, here is defined not only as the encounter with the marvelous, but actually the beginning of knowledge and theory itself. What follows in the remainder of my talk is going to be a selection of images that I hope might prompt us to take new stock of Renaissance representations of nature and landscape, in large part through the lens of Ovid, in all of its embodied meanings, and above all, as a source of wonder, but also at times of fear. All of the examples to be shown are wrought, of course, by human artifice, yet in every instance are suggestive of nature as the true inspiration of creation. Here, to borrow the language of the Wunderkammer, I show you two especially dazzling hybrid manifestations of artificialia imitating naturalia in 3 dimensions, competing with nature from stalk to fruit, as you can see at right, in their ripeness of invention. But what of painted landscapes? To paraphrase one of Lucretius's chief tenets in Book 2, nature works freely without masters. And I would make a similar argument for the painters, both North and South, to be discussed next, unfettered as they were to an unusual degree by pictorial convention. Ancient and contemporary poetics are, in spirit if not letter, are, I'm sure, a more compelling inspiration than pictorial examples. Above all, Piero's creations are instinct with life, as are Leonardo's, as are Dürer's, deriving their particular vigor not merely from ancient verse, but from experience, mingled with imagination and the keen engagement of the senses. Be that as it may, Renaissance landscape in scholarly literature had long been seen as subject to man's needs and desires, typically conceived as reposeful retreats on the one hand, or as a place of human occupation and dominion on the other. The author of one of the first surveys of Renaissance landscape began his study with the following claim, quote, "Renaissance landscape, whatever its particular form, exists to serve mankind. Its fields and groves are carefully groomed and only rarely give way to wild ravines, spectacular vistas, or deserted places. This domesticated world gives sustenance to the physical needs and spiritual yearnings of the men who inhabit it. In the broadest sense, the landscape is humanized," unquote. A number of disruptive exceptions, as seen here, however, flash out from the Renaissance, redefining its limits, some especially surprising given their devotional context, as seen in this altarpiece on the right and a very small panel on the left by the lapsed Carmelite friar painter Fra Filippo Lippi. Landscape devoid or virtually devoid of human presence, however, remained a rare sight in Italian Renaissance painting. More examples, albeit still not many, survive in the graphic arts, as illustrated by this delicate double-sided sheet by Fra Bartolomeo, also a man of the cloth of the Dominican faith. I cannot help seeing the verso sketch shown here at right as something akin to a portrait of an actual tree. This impression grows even stronger, almost disquietingly so, in the near-contemporary prints of Albrecht Altdorfer in the north, and his quasi-anthropomorphic arboreal giants. In fact, we just saw the print, along with the student here in the second row, in the Met's print room yesterday. It's only about this small in scale and meant for a very specific market. We also have examples south of the Alps, as seen in this pair of spontaneous nature sketches by Parmigianino, both commonly dated to his Roman stay of 1524 to 27. The study at left bears an enigmatic inscription along its upper border from an ancient text, in this case, Book 5 of Virgil's Aeneid. It reads, "Chosen youths, the bravest hearts." Given their private, highly tactile nature, it was, above all, in prints that Renaissance artists were granted freest rein to indulge their fantasia. As seen in this engraving by Giulio Campagnola, landscape comes to rival, even dwarf, the human protagonists that inhabit it, the vegetation now running rampant. On occasion, nature creates monsters, as seen in the same printmaker's earlier Astrologer, in some ways as slightly comical as it is ominous. But it is certainly an uneasy laughter that it evokes. Echoing the alpine wilderness, viscerally familiar to their makers, northern prints show nature running wild, as seen in these examples by Lucas Cranach and Wolf Huber. Nature that is uninhabitable except by those beyond the reach of human covenants. Here, they give way to covens. And Giulio Campagnola himself was no doubt aware of many of the northern examples that I just showed. Standing apart as the most singular example of independent landscape painting, however, at the turn of the 16th century, is Piero and his forest fire, with its menagerie of animals, both domestic and exotic. More than a dozen species of birds are shown perched in the trees or arrowing through the smoky skies, some observed on the wing, others from butcher counters. Nowhere is Piero's preoccupation with the mobility of matter and the fertility of nature in all of their inexhaustible variety more evident than in this scene's human-faced marvels seen at right. He actually began by painting this sow's snout and then over-painted it and included, it's not even a human face, probably a fawn's or satyr's face in its stead. But again, this is the subject of a different talk altogether. But speaking of metamorphoses, how could I not include it? The notion of nature as a generative force, as a living and life-giving power, was deeply rooted in the writings of the Stoics. As defined by Democritus and Heraclitus before him, the vision of nature as natura naturans, literally nature naturing, or nature as an active subject and catalyst, was set apart from the conception of created nature, termed natura naturata, or nature natured, nature as object, something altered or tamed by humankind. It is the ever-changeable active natura naturans, the cycle of growth, death, and rebirth, that animated Piero's and Leonardo's vision of the world and their visual manifestations of this vision. Heraclitus's doctrine of perpetual change, like that of Lucretius and Ovid, envisions nature in constant change. All things are protean. The earth sinks into the sea and rises again as the, quote, cosmos works by harmony of tensions, like the lyre and bow. In the Greek philosophers' writings, the metaphor for the mutability of nature is not the atom, however, as seen in Lucretius, but fire. One has to wait until Giovanni Larciani's, not a household name by any means, so-called crest landscapes shown here, starkly different in tone, to say the least, from Piero's hunting scenes, to encounter a comparable example of dominant landscape. More reminiscent of Fra Bartolomeo's delicate pen and ink landscapes, Larciani's vistas offer sweeping views of varied landforms, from rolling hills to spurs of rock. The painting's current state as a triptych is misleading. The original constituted one single visual field, as indicated by the continuous contours of the mountains and outcrops of stone. And I'm not going to go into the subject matter, which remains very enigmatic. It's yet another one of these visual poems. But in the largest of these three now cut canvases, one sees what scholars commonly believe is the scene of Narcissus, fatally gazing at his own beautiful reflection in a glassy pool. Approximately 20 years earlier than the crest landscapes in Milan, Leonardo produced this wholly immersive wall-to-ceiling fresco to adorn the Sala della Asse, or the so-called room of the wooden boards or planks, situated on the first floor of the tower at the northeast corner of the Castello Sforzesco. This space, and I have to say I love this old black and white photograph even better. The space derived its name from the wooden panels that once lined this reception chamber for visiting ambassadors, and you can imagine their sense of wonder at sitting below this fictive bower. Decorated with intertwining fruit-laden plants, forming a great knotty canopy above, this hall was commissioned by Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, in 1498, soon after Leonardo's completion of The Last Supper. Of particular interest to me is the monochromatic decoration that lives below this interwoven pergola of branches and foliage. A rocky substrate that appears on the verge of being rent asunder by a massive root system. Though surviving in only a fragmentary state, as is plainly visible here, it is clear that Leonardo's vision is no mere ornament. It is organism, a living, growing ecosystem, partly observed, partly, of course, invented by an artist come botanist and geologist. Once again, in cases like these, the genre term landscape itself proves wholly inadequate. Nature here becomes metabolic. Leonardo's understanding of human and animal life is that of an ongoing and unstable process of transformation, as it is in Ovid, marvelous and terrible in its power. Envisioning the earth as a breathing organism, Leonardo conjured seemingly primordial vistas in as incongruous a genre as female portraiture. Nature, devoid of human presence, assumes the purest, most uncorrupted form of sanctity in the craggy, mist-shrouded distances of his Madonna of the Rocks, already seen, and this late Virgin and Child with St. Anne, also in the Louvre. Leonardo worked on this altarpiece far too long to ever deliver it, and thus the painting stands as the resolved, conceptually, but yet again unfinished culmination of a series of studies of great ambition. Testifying to the inseparable union of intellect and fantasia, the St. Anne altarpiece finds its complement in a well-known passage in the Leicester Codex, something akin to a kind of anatomical geology or geological anatomy, recalling Pliny the Elder's innards of the earth. We might say, he writes, that the earth has a spirit of growth, that its flesh is the soil, its bones the arrangement and connection of the rocks, of which the mountains are composed, its cartilage the tufa, and its blood the springs of water. The pool of blood which lies round the heart is the ocean, and its breathing and the increase and decrease of the blood in the pulses is represented in the earth by the flow and ebb of the sea, unquote. It may be argued, too, that Leonardo's maps are as alive as his anatomical studies. Once again, it is impossible to ignore the echoes of both Lucretius and Ovid here. In a passage that would have been the envy of Ted Hughes, or maybe Ovid, who knows, Lucretius himself writes, "First earth cloaked the scene, hill and dale, with every kind of leaf and shining green, and green the blooming meadows gleamed. All trees began to vie, galloping at a terrific clip to race up towards the sky. And just as feathers, fur, or bristles straight away start to grow on four-footed beasts or on birds mighty on the wing, just so the fledgling earth first sprouted a down of herbs and coppices. Next she engendered the tribes of living things, the many races that arose by different causes and in many different ways. Only earth is left, therefore, deserving of the name of mother," the poet concludes, "since it's from the earth all living beings come." And so, in conclusion, in the spirit also of the Metamorphoses, I believe there are new ways, many new ways, I hope, of not only looking at and understanding humans' relationship to nature, but new ways of understanding artists' own conceptions of a more pantheistic universe, one animated by non-human charisma. A vision of nature as a source of boundless wonder. Pointing the way forward in one of the earlier inspirations behind my own work is an edited anthology from 2002 titled Landscape and Power. In the opening essay to this volume, W.J.T. Mitchell announces that the text's aim is to, quote, change landscape from a noun to a verb. Mitchell asks that we think of landscape not as an object to be seen or as a text to be read, but, quote, as a process by which social and subjective identities are to be made, unquote. Once landscape is understood as a potent medium of expression and not a pictorial category, the central question we ask of it can now be framed in a very different way. Not how a landscape appears or how it might be decoded iconographically, but rather by what it does. Once activated by viewers' attention, how does a landscape behave or act upon us as the viewer? As we have seen when applied to Piero's and Dürer's and Leonardo's responsive environments, the transformation of the term landscape into a dynamic force leads to all sorts of rich possibilities. At a time when images were expected to cultivate a new and more accurate sense of the natural world, a growing number, as we have seen, artists in the Renaissance north and south of the Alps went a great deal further, generating enlivened, living environments, both natural and fantastic, and like Lucretius's atomist universe, presenting us with a more mobile, unpredictable, and I would argue, sensuous vision of the world, dissolving its fixity and opaque solidity. Salvatico è quel che si salva, Leonardo once punned. Indeed, the first beholders of Piero's, Fra Filippo's, Altdorfer's primal woods would have nodded in knowing agreement. Wild is he who saves himself. Thank you.